Good afternoon and welcome. It's my pleasure to moderate this important discussion on diversity in donation. My name is Greg Grossman. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Advancing Sight Network. I would like to ask everyone at this point to silence your cell phones. So Advancing Sight Network is a large nonprofit eye banking network based in Alabama with affiliates in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And our mission is to really enhance lives through the preservation of eyesight. And we do that locally and globally in partnership with our large networks. And really, partnership is why we're here today. I want to welcome all of you joining us here in the Phillips Education Conference Center, as well as all of you who are joining us online today. This panel has been assembled to help us understand the need for diversity and donation. And it's really most appropriate that we're doing it this time as it is National Minority Donation Awareness Month. So really happy to be doing this. So I'd like to first recognize all of you who made this possible for us. The Caring Foundation of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Alabama, whose support allows Advancing Sight to educate and empower people in Alabama to be knowledgeable about eye donation, with a particular emphasis and focus on minority communities. Kim Mitchell is here, and she's ASN's project manager, who is helping to develop community engagement programs. That's so Alabama residents can get access to eye health information and services. Advancing Sight's Network Diversity Committee, which is made up of staff here, which works on inclusion and access for our staff and the donation community. Advancing Sight's Network's Board of Trustees, who supports all our research initiatives. And finally, our donation partners at Legacy of Hope. So diversity can be defined as being fully including people from a wide range of economic, ethnic, and ethnic backgrounds, also genders, sexual orientations, in fact, a variety of factors, all walks of life. But throughout history, certain groups have been excluded from full participation or governance of or planning in institutional and social programs. And unfortunately, donation of tissues, eyes, and organs has been one of those areas impacted by lack of inclusion. So today, donation authorization rates of certain minority groups are about 50% lower than other groups. With our panel today, we have here, we will touch base on some historical injustices which have really led to this lack of diversity in donation. We will talk about how this lack of diversity in donation has negatively impacted the development of ocular drugs and therapies. And we will then turn our thoughts to developing sustainable programs in Alabama and other states to increase minority and underserved community involvement in the donation process. Okay, the format for today's presentation will be a panel discussion with time at the end reserved for questions from our audience. And those of you on the live stream can put their questions in the chat box, and Candace Lee will relay those to us. So today we are honored by our esteemed panelists, Dr. Raegan Durant, Dr. Alecia Gross, and Dr. Christopher Girkin. And I would now like each of them to give us a brief introduction, 5 to 7 minutes, about themselves and their work. Dr. Gross, would you start off, please?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Alecia Gross. I'm honored to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk with all of you. I am a classically trained biochemist, a membrane protein biochemist, and I first fell in love with membrane proteins as a technician before I went to graduate school. I received my PhD at Brandeis University, looking at the protein rhodopsin, which is the dim light photoreceptor protein that's found in rods of your eye that is responsible for capturing a photon of light and initiating a signal cascade that will then signal that cell to the next higher order neurons in your retina. My dissertation focused on point mutations in that protein in that gene that caused congenital stationary night blindness. So the rod cone dystrophy that causes, it can be stationary, but in general, it can be a progressive disease as well. So I studied that as an undergrad, just basic, as a PhD student, straight up biochemistry. And then I moved to Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, where I learned how to use knock-in and knock-out mice as a model for human disease. So I learned how to make knock-in and knock-out transgenic mice and transgenic tadpoles. So believe it or not, Xenopus laevis, these really big frogs have baseball bat-sized photoreceptors, and in 2 weeks, I can express whatever proteins I want, and I can cause retinal degeneration and use them as a model for human disease as well. So I started on faculty at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in 2006. My lab studies, it first started studying out how rhodopsin, my favorite protein, gets expressed and trafficked to where it needs to go. If that process doesn't happen, it causes degeneration of the photoreceptors and pandemic cell death, and the patient goes completely blind, typically with the disease retinitis pigmentosa. So I made animal models that recapitulated that disease with the hope of understanding the molecular mechanism of what was faulty, so that way later on we could go in and try to slow that process down. So you may go blind, but you'll go blind when you're 150, so it doesn't matter. So I've recently, my lab has turned away from rhodopsin trafficking and protein trafficking to, we have uncovered the molecular mechanisms of cytoskeletal regulation in rods and cones. And so in neurons, the actin network is critical for development, but it's also critical for protein trafficking. And so that's the basic research side of my lab. And most recently, I have fallen in collaboration with, I've actually forced my way into collaboration with Dr. Girkin, who is a glaucoma specialist. He'll tell you about his research in a moment, but he and another amazing faculty member, Massimo Fazio, are studying humans as a model for glaucoma using human eyes. And so I wanted to uncover the subcellular mechanisms of the ramifications of high intraocular pressure in his systems. So I'm really the cellular protein person involved with his amazing projects too. So the cool thing about both sides of my lab, the basic research side, in my opinion, cool thing, the basic research side and the clinical side of my lab is they came, like we like to say, they plowed toward each other full speed at 85 miles an hour down a highway, and goodness spilled out, because we found out that the cytoskeletal arrangement parts that were critical in rod and cone formation were also critical. All those proteins get upregulated in glaucomatous eyes. So what that means to me as a cell biologist in the retina, upon high intraocular pressure, we're seeing ganglion cell movement to get away from the regions of high strain in the eye. And so we're together with our collaborations at UAB and with Legacy of Hope and the Advancing Sight, we're uncovering the mechanisms of glaucoma, of high intraocular pressure glaucoma.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that I am the designated non-vision expert on the panel, but I will forge ahead nonetheless. I am an internist by training, and I'm a professor of medicine at UAB. I also serve as associate dean in the School of Medicine for Diversity and Inclusion. I also am medical director at Cooper Green Mercy Health Services Authority. For those of you who are tuning in who are not from the Birmingham area, it's a publicly funded, affiliated ambulatory care center that serves a largely low-income and uninsured population here locally. And this focus on donation, particularly among minoritized populations, actually resonates with me. Much of the research that I do on the UAB side is related to participation in research studies among minoritized populations. And interestingly, one of the very first research projects that I worked on was not related to research participation, but actually was related to disincentives to kidney donation among African Americans. And I'll tell a brief anecdote that I think really is emblematic of why we're here today. So I went to Johns Hopkins for medical school, and I was a fourth-year medical student, had a research elective, and was fortunate enough to get paired with health services researchers on campus who were studying kidney donation, live kidney donation among African Americans. And you have to rewind 20 years. This was at a time when live kidney donation was just becoming more common. And so I was, as a lowly medical student, I was piloting a survey. So making cold calls to people out in the community. We got a telephone list from a third party that was enriched for African Americans locally, just based on zip code and other data points at the area level data that they used. And so this is our draft survey, and so I'm just figuring out how it plays basically with the audience, and it asks all manner of questions about what they know about kidney donation. Would they be willing? Intended to be hypothetically, would they be willing to donate? And about the fifth call in, and I honestly don't remember exactly, but someone said something, and a bulb went off in my head that all of these people thought that I was soliciting kidneys over the phone. And so, needless to say, we stopped, and I talked to the faculty member, and faculty member was working with a fellow, and we revamped it and fixed it, and ultimately got it published. But the reason I tell that anecdote is I think it's emblematic of some of the pitfalls, particularly in talking about donations, organ donation in minoritized communities. And, think about it from the standpoint of 20 years ago, that was perhaps jarring to some of those individuals. And if we think about Hopkins and Baltimore in particular, in the interim, we all probably have heard of the tragic story of Henrietta Lacks, which was an actual patient at Hopkins, and they derived HeLa cells, which were tumor cells from an actual patient. And these cells were marketed and were very instrumental in helping us understand tumor biology, but of course, unbeknownst to the patient and her family, and only to be discovered many, many years later. So in that, hindsight is 2020, but in that context, you can imagine now how jarring, even that simple misunderstanding would be relative to that time when I was initially piloting the survey. So my work in looking at minority participation in clinical trials has many parallels, I think, with the way we think about organ donation in similar populations. I think one common pitfall that we all try to avoid in thinking, when we think about health disparities in general, is the pitfall of blaming the patient. So it's easy sometimes to look at worse outcomes in a particular group. And it's not that anyone wakes up in the morning saying, I'm going to figure out how I can pin all these outcomes on the patient. But even in our approach, inadvertently can come across as if we're saying all of these things are due to the fact that, you know, this patient belongs to this subgroup. And instead, and I think this holds true in thinking about organ donation, I think what we really have to do is think about the broader context in addition to the actual individuals. And so that context includes a number of factors. It includes the way in which minoritized communities as a whole and as individuals come to know about donation. How do we engage them? How are they approached? And it also, there also needs to be some thought given to whether or not the educational approaches and even, quite frankly, the procurement approaches, are they culturally sensitive and are they carried out in a manner that is conducive to certain groups being more willing to be donors, and that extends obviously not just to the deceased making a decision a priori, but also obviously next of kin at the time of death. And so all of these factors do have to really be considered in addition to what's going on with the individual. One of the things that comes up a lot is trust. And I think there's a tendency to go directly to trust. And I think we have to be really careful about the way that we think about trust. We did some work many, many years ago in the context of minority participation in clinical trials, looking at different levels of trust. And we were looking in a group of about 800 community dwelling seniors in the Boston area, and found that there were Black-white differences with African Americans reporting lower trust, but only in societal trust. When we looked at institutional and interpersonal trust separately, there were no differences. And so what it suggests is that we have an opportunity as a research community, as a healthcare community, and even more broadly, and in this context, as a sort of organ allocation community, to really mitigate what may be some societal distrust that oftentimes as an individual we may not have control over. We can't wave a magic wand over someone's broader outlook and his or her life experiences, but we can establish some rapport as institutions and as individuals to mitigate that. And that can go a long way toward helping to engage communities as well as individuals toward broader goals around improving participation in organ donation and other aspects of research and care. So that's a bit of a snapshot of my perspective and the broader context of my work, and hopefully we can continue this discussion once we get to the panel portion. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you.
So I'm Chris Girkin, and I'm a clinician scientist. I started my formal training after residency in glaucoma. Oh, sorry, there we go. Thank you. And so I focus my clinical practice on the treatment of glaucoma, and my research interest there as well. Glaucoma, as many of you know, is a much greater burden within the African American community. There's easily 5 times the rate of blindness. The disease is more severe and progresses earlier in that population. And so I moved to UAB in 1999 to join the Health Services Research and Health Disparities Program that was building at the time, and looking both at kind of coming at the problem unlike the opposite end of the spectrum from Dr. Gross, from the clinical health services side, looking at the barriers to access to care initially, and then using the evolving clinical imaging devices at the time that have now grown to be able to image the back of the eye in high resolution, to look at the mechanisms by which the pressure in the eye differ. The eyes between different racial groups differ in the response to pressure, both in terms of how the tissue is perfused from its blood supply and the mechanical behavior within the eye wall as it stretches and inflates as pressure varies. And that happens to differ between African Americans and those of European ancestry structurally in the back of the eye, and those strains, those stretches, and things that these tissues and cells that Dr. Gross studies feel fundamentally different. So that got us more interested in mechanism and built this relationship with what was the Alabama Eye Bank many, many years ago, that I got to know many of you through, looking at human tissue. And human tissue is really special, kind of a special place in research where you can study the disease in humans, look at how it behaves long term, and learn a lot. You can't take their eyes out and dissect them. That's frowned upon. Most patients don't particularly care for that approach. And with animal models, they are very informative. They can reflect disease, but there are fundamental differences, both at the cellular level, at the tissue level, that it's just not going to be the same. So that human bridge is really important in mechanism. If we look at the genetic studies that have been done and we've contributed to, in populations derived from primarily European ancestral groups, Asian groups, and African American groups, the African American population doesn't share any of the genes that are related to glaucoma with the European derived populations. And those genes code for the things like proteins that Dr. Gross is interested in that are fundamentally related to the pathogenesis, the mechanism behind the generation of that disease. So if we only have the tissues in one segment of the population, it's really hard to understand mechanism to the degree, to the sophistication that we really need to understand it to develop the new pharmacologic genetics treatments, screening mechanisms, all these things to really get at the mechanism of disease. And that's really what brought us together, and brought us together with the Eye Bank. And it's been a great collaboration, both with Legacy of Hope, Advancing Sight. I have to keep telling myself Advancing Sight. It's with the Eye Bank for so long. Just a great cooperative group that's been very progressive, and we've been able to recruit a large African American cohort of donors and see those fundamental structural differences in the eye in the human tissue as well. I think that has stimulated this new collaboration to really start looking at mechanisms. So that's been fun, but it'd be impossible without a sustained effort to really look at increasing the amount of minority donation in vision.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you again for being here. A lot of great comments are already, and we're going to turn back to some of them. But I think, Chris, I'd like to take up where you left off in really connecting donation for research to community health. And I think part of the way you got us, but I'd like to hear from each of you a little bit more about that, seeking to understand the connection between donation of eyes for research and from people of diverse backgrounds and inclusive cures and therapies. So you talked about differences already in disease mechanisms, but take us a little further and tell us why there is a need for the importance of tissues from groups from diverse backgrounds, all the way to new cures and therapies for diseases like AMD, diabetic retinopathy, you mentioned glaucoma. These are diseases that really impact people all throughout the world. We're talking in the course of millions. And in the case of some of these diseases like diabetic retinopathy and glaucoma, certain groups are affected more than others. So can you maybe, Chris, can you start off with that?
Sure. So pretty much all the major causes of blindness, if you look at macular degeneration, glaucoma, and diabetic retinopathy, kind of the big three in the developed world, they all profoundly differ between racial groups. And the largest difference is between those of European ancestry and African ancestry. So macular degeneration is the leading cause of blindness in those of European descent. And so you can look at the differences between those populations and do two things. One, explore mechanism, like why they're different will tell you a lot about why the disease is occurring, what the exposures are, what the causative elements are. What's causing it, how to address those disparities. In glaucoma and diabetes, it's much more severe in the African American population. Similarly, it improves both health access. When you start getting down to the human tissue level, you have broad overlapping mechanisms, the immune system, that inflammatory response, differences in cellular structure, mitochondria, the little factories in the cell that produce the cell energy, differ largely between those groups. Blood pressure, diabetes, systemic factors all play a role. And so if we get tissues only from a single population, similarly to in clinical studies, you only really look at those mechanisms as they've been impacted within that single group. The genetic example is the genetic example from the NEIGHBOR study, which is this large international collaboration looking at the genetics of glaucoma, and other efforts of the Alecia study. There was some of that we participated in. The large difference between the genetic profiles between these patients is really telling that there's fundamental difference in mechanism. And so if you don't have the cells, you're going to have the wrong cells, you're going to develop the wrong treatments targeted to the wrong population. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, that's great points there. And I know, Dr. Durant, you have some experience in clinical trials. And as we now know, one of our partners here in Alabama, Acclinate, they're a private group who's really developed a unique platform to get more minority groups onto clinical trials. And they're located in Huntsville and also here in Birmingham. But I always thought that that, of course, is a worthy thing, because you want to understand how the drug or device works within a broad range, both efficacy, does it work, and safety, does it have any negative effects? So you want to know that in the general population. But I always thought, as a basic researcher, it's just as profound, maybe more to when you're developing those drugs, before you spend $1 billion and then go to clinical trial. But when you're developing those drugs, to understand the particular pathways of all these different clusters of genes. So in the preclinical trial, pick the candidates that the pathways are going to be more inclusive to cover a broad range. As we know, many diseases are kind of an umbrella group, that there's many pathways, chemical pathways that lead to one disease state. So can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that is what you just articulated is really the direction that research and medicine are going in, and namely that we are, as we think about the broad umbrella term of precision medicine, we have to ensure that the research that we're doing situates us such that we can look at these various subgroups. In so many instances, they're defined by racial or ethnic characteristics, but obviously the underlying factors oftentimes are genetic factors, and that's really probably where we should be focusing to ensure that the therapies that we are developing are going to be applicable to the largest groups of people that are affected. And so my hope is that over time, we will be shifting in focus as we talk about including minoritized groups based on certain characteristics, that we will shift and then begin to, in two ways, really. One will be thinking about how we can drill down a little bit more and focus more on the genetic and biological underpinnings that drive those differences and focus on those. And then the second way, and this is a little bit more closely related to the research that I do, which is more health services research or behavioral research, and that is really thinking about the contextual factors that we really have to consider as well. I think obviously the biology is paramount, but when we start thinking about how once we develop a treatment or certainly something that's programmatic, once it's implemented, ensuring that it can, the psychosocial context that the person or environment that the person exists in is conducive to uptake of that intervention and situates a person to benefit from it. So.
Yeah, that's great. I like how you really brought in that, genetic differences aren't always racial or ethnic differences. There's many crossovers there, and that different groups of people, some ways these are real categorizations as are you real as far as history maybe, but sometimes they're just groups that we've assigned categories to. So from what I really got is kind of getting a broad range of knowledge about people and making sure we have representation from those. I'm going to stay and keep picking on you for a minute as we switch to the next subject, and that is talking about historical medical injustices. So, not all of the reasons behind why there is lack of diversity in donation, it can be justified by historical wrongs, but I think in many cases this is true, and so it's in my opinion, you mentioned Henrietta Lacks. There's certainly the Tuskegee study here in Alabama, which is a really horrendous example about not being upfront with people, not getting consent, and not treating people as stakeholders, and certain groups as that. So you kind of said some of this about trust, but you brought some new attention to me in that you found out it's not a lack of trust all across the boards. And so I'd like to hear how can some of those same systems work to earn trust back. Another thing I think that's connected is how can gains and positive results in studies be shared with the community? Sure. I know there's new ways that now we comply with.
So I think the broader context of historic discrimination and legacy of injustice can't be ignored. You mentioned Henrietta Lacks case, and then here locally, many of us are familiar with the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis experiment at Tuskegee. And those are two very high profile examples, but I guarantee you, if we went to any large academic medical center, there would be some story, perhaps one not as well or widely known, but there would be something, if nothing else, just a legacy of discrimination in some way, shape, or form. And so unfortunately, this is a really prevalent backdrop for many patients, particularly African Americans, as they think about healthcare and research. That being said, I do believe very strongly that there are ways to cultivate the sort of trust on an individual level as institutions and with entire communities. I think one of the main pathways that we do that is, quite frankly, engaging people in a very long-term manner and just in the abstract. So I think the problem is sometimes, and I'm speaking about academic medical centers, there can be this sort of helicopter approach. So the academic medical center comes buzzing around metaphorically when they need something. And that's not the right approach. We have to engage people on a long-term basis and sometimes just sit down and establish partnerships. And to the extent that those partnerships with communities, they have to be mutually beneficial. We have to ask them, what is important to you? So if we're talking about issues around eye banks, talk to them about what's important to them, how loss of vision has affected, their lives or the lives of their loved ones, and get a sense for where they are. And then I think efforts moving forward can then be jointly pursued in that context of those priorities for them. One of the other things that's important is Dr. Girkin mentioned many of the disparities that we see in specific diseases, glaucoma being probably the chief example, being disproportionately affecting African Americans. So really helping people to understand that while it may appear opaque, this research that's being pursued is going to help people like you. And I think that gives people a connection to the research, and they understand that it's not just sort of in the ether, but instead it's at some point going to make its way to benefiting the communities that look like them and individuals that look like them. And that's one key area where dissemination is important. So, I'll poke fun at myself. We like to see our work published in scientific journals, but we really shouldn't stop there. We shouldn't get it published and then pat ourselves on the back and move on. We really have to figure out ways that we can disseminate this work to broader communities, particularly lay communities, in a way that's meaningful to them and in a way that they understand that this work is impacting or has the potential to improve well-being for them. And, I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of how best to do that. I think I'll speak for myself, we probably need to look to our younger colleagues that use social media now and everything they do, and then figure out how we can harness that power to reach out to these communities, because in so many instances, I think even when with well-meaning individuals, these partnerships are born, work is done, and then it just sort of comes to a screeching halt, and the community partners hear nothing about it. And that's not a way to foster continuing rapport, continuing trust, and to build on that, such that people in communities more broadly want to continue to be in partnership with researchers and academic and other related institutions.
Right. You just ended that last sentence with what was forming in my mind a summary of what you were saying, and that is partnership. You mentioned helicopter research, in which researchers go into a community or go into another country and they kind of extract data, zip out of there, and that local community is not served by it. And I think, when I heard you mentioning all these different kind of factors that we need to think about and how to engage people, it sounded like you were summing up a partnership. You're doing onboarding, you're not dropping in, you're making them, in essence, any person part of this, a stakeholder. And that's, I think that's a huge thing. And we see this idea evolving, but like you said, in the third last sentence, that maybe there's new ways to approach partnership. And that's going to be better for long-term sustainability. And I think that it behooves all of us to look at the next generation and how they're communicating, because it does have meaning to them. Alecia, I would like to pick on you for a second here. Jumping off of the same topic, what practices in the academic or patient settings have proved useful in addressing ongoing disparities in health equity, as well as addressing fears, reservations, and misconceptions? And so obviously you're in the academic setting, you probably cross over a little bit in the patient setting, at least understanding, what the end goal is. And I know your lab has been part of a unique program at UAB, being certified in diverse training of your staff. So I'd like you to share what practices that you've seen that may be useful coming from your fields.
Well, I'll tell you, we need to do more. And so the things that I mentioned are going to be a very small drop in a very big bucket. And it's apparent we're not doing enough as scientists to be able to get the word out. And I totally agree with Dr. Durant. I think people of a younger generation, than myself included, who do a lot of social media. I think that's a really fabulous direction, and to be able to get the word out. A couple of things I want to touch lightly on, my little drops in a big bucket. So you were mentioning what my lab does. So there's a fabulous program at UAB that I'm drawing a blank on the name right now. We're Safe Zone certified. So I have gone through a series of through the UAB's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I have gone through a series of courses that help me be a safe zone for folks, underrepresented minorities, LGBTQIA plus communities, knowing that I as a bystander, I'm a white woman from New Hampshire, but I live in a very diverse community. My family is very diverse. I appreciate the diversity and how we are a stronger university, because we're the second most diverse university in the country, public university. And so I do appreciate that, and I see the strengths in it. My lab itself we have a diverse lab of various backgrounds and ethnicities, and I ask everyone, I don't require, because I think that's a little harsh, but I ask everyone in my lab to become Safe Zone certified. So we sit through these courses, and not together, because I want them to be able to speak freely without their boss there, but I have gone through and taken these amazing courses that are offered at UAB, and I have really learned to appreciate how very limited my thinking was in the past, and how I need to keep going back and taking these courses in the future, so I can incorporate that diversity. So that's one little step I can do to help diversity in my science. I think I have a student in my lab now. She's a third-year PhD student. Her name is Haley Levi. For those of you who do follow TikTok, she's at Chaotically Science. She does science, but chaotically. That's her stick. She's an African-American woman from the desert of Paris, California. PERIS, California. And she's a first-generation student, and she had to blaze her own path to get to where she is today. So I recently just stepped down after 10 years of being the director of the Cell Molecular Developmental Biology graduate program at UAB. I helped recruit her to UAB because she's a firecracker. She is smart, and she is feisty, and she's amazing. And when she came to UAB, and I was fortunate enough to have her join my lab, I got a phone call an email actually from McVillian publishing, or not, production company, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name because it's spelled funny. But it's an Academy Award winning production company that makes IMAX movies, and they wanted to have Haley because of her online presence. She's a micro influencer. She has 12,000 plus followers, and she talks to getting underrepresented minorities in STEM and how she really got to graduate school, even though her parents didn't go to college, even though she went to, she had to fight her way to be able to learn how to study. And she's just unbelievable. And so they're going to put her on this, on one of the IMAX movies they do. If you see them, they already had one narrated by Jeff Bridges on civil engineering. And I wanted to quit and become a civil engineer after watching this. She does that. And she's also going to be on a CBS TV show that she's filming this week in the lab. Mission Unstoppable. They found her online. And so it's folks like Haley that will get the younger generation. She's in her 20s. I could be her mother. She's in her 20s, and she is an incredible force of goodness and science. And she's smart and she's bright. She will do better if she gets her PhD. So I keep reminding her that she can't go on and do all of the extra stuff without earning her PhD first. But people like that, I think we have hope in the next generation, right? So I ask her to help us and correct me if I'm doing anything that will make her or anyone else uncomfortable. Something else I wanted to touch on that's a small little drop in the big bucket is UAB has this program called Discoveries in the Makings. And when it first came out, I thought it was a little weird, not weird, but a little bit I didn't think it would work, and I have seen the light. So Discoveries in the Making is a way for us as scientists, as basic research scientists and clinical scientists, to reach the lay public, right? All of the money that I get from my NIH grants are from taxpayer money. So really, you guys are helping pay my research program. So I owe it to all of you to be able to talk about my science in a way that you understand where your tax dollars go. And Lori McMahon started this when she was the dean of the graduate school. And the graduate school, through Discoveries in the Makings, you can volunteer for this, go and speak in libraries in the Jefferson County library system. And the amount of folks that come in from public, just non-scientists that are blue collar, white collar folks that go to their area libraries and learn science. There's a clinician that speaks on like autism, for example, and then a basic research scientist that talks about their research in autism, for example. And I think that's another way that we're trying to get the word out to get health disparities and see how we're seeing a difference. So I would go in, I could imagine Dr. Girkin and I coming in and talking about the clinical side and then the basic research side of why we would need, how we could touch different underrepresented communities and minoritized communities. I don't think that's enough. So having young students do things, young folks, young amazing scientists on social media still isn't enough because of fake news that's out there, and our culture these days, it's very tricky to know what to believe. And science, apparently in society, science can be seen as a religious system where you believe it or not, and science is science, right? So I don't know how to, I think the bottom line is we are open to any suggestions that anyone has to be able to disseminate our what we learn in the lab and to be able to help not just personalized medicine, but medicine across different minoritized communities. And my dream would be to slow down retinal degeneration. That's my dream. It's been my dream for over 25 years. And I can imagine if there are some populations that I can target with specific drugs, I would love to be able to do that. And through basic mechanisms, I can help design drugs and use existing drugs that we have to be able to help slow down those pathways. And then we could look through data to see if the drugs would be the same in other populations or not, right? And so if we can get those information out, not just from the journal articles that we publish in scientific journals, but also through public, I would love to see that happen in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a necessity for us to counteract falsehoods being spread, but to also really give back to these stakeholders and share. And you and I have worked, we were just talking that Dr. Gross and I have known each other for a couple decades here, and we've worked on retinal degenerations with populations which there's only a few thousand people. And it's easy for pharmaceuticals to say, oh, you know, it's a small cohort, but, you know, to those families, it means a lot. So I always couple, you know, the idea of diversity and inclusion with rare diseases. And that's a cohort we often don't think of, because these people live unique lives. There's not the same support for them. And so it is also my hope that you know, we could reach all these different groups, including those who, you know, whose fate right now is to be blind in 10 years.
Well, something else to dovetail on what you just mentioned. You're right. We both have a fondness for rare diseases and genetic diseases that are 1 in 100,000 or even less. But a lot of the cellular mechanisms that occur because of those genetic mutations are identical across all retinal degenerations. The inflammatory response that Dr. Girkin spoke of earlier, the inflammatory response is marked an increase the second you have an infarct in a photoreceptor cell. It doesn't matter what the cause is.
Right.
So if we could slow down, inflammatory response has a role, but then it needs to go away because it can cause massive cell damage and cell death. And the trouble with the retina are these are post-mitotic cells that once they die, you can't get them back. We can't regrow the retina. We're not zebrafish that can do that, right? So how do we if we could just slow down the degeneration, we can get folks to be able to see well into their 80s. The market increase in their life would be astounding. And so I think having realistic goals like that, even with genetic diseases that are very, very low in the population, the overall population, by looking at the subcellular ramifications, I think we can learn a lot on how to save sight. And we can also cross over between underrepresented minority populations and those that are just, you know, between the different groups of folks. And so, yeah, sure, you have this genetic mutation because of this heritage, and you have this genetic mutation because of this, but the underlying cause of the dysfunction is this big, massive badness down here. And if we can slow this down, this part will be okay.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and a point worth repeating, that just because we're addressing one small group of the world, or whether it's a rare disease or whether it's a particular group, be they lifestyle or ethnic background, that information is always applicable to other diseases for understanding the human body and physiology. And I could say in our time working together, we've seen an enormous amount of our understanding about photoreceptors, how they traffic proteins because of these rare conditions.
Yeah.
All of a sudden something goes wrong, you go, well, we really don't know what goes right. But now we do. We now know all these different characters. Both of you said something that it kind of coalesced in my brain. You said about engaging with people is like ask what they want. And then you said again that word ask when you were talking about this unique student who you can pose questions to and ask. And I think, boy, that for me, that idea of asking, I think that's been one of the biggest barriers, not asking, is biggest barriers to really engaging with people in a partnership, because there's so much assumption, you know, okay, we'll do this, you know, we're benefiting you, this. Getting someone engaged in onboarding is about asking and bringing people closer. So I think that can go a lot further. I want to ask you, Dr. Girkin, from your experiences in the clinical environment, what practices have you seen change that have been effective in maybe making a wider range of patients feel comfortable, or what techniques have you learned to really share with them to have so they feel like stakeholders and included?
Sure. So many of the things Dr. Durant mentioned regarding how you engage on an individual level and how those relationships really aren't as strained as they are in a larger society level. I think you really feel those in the clinic and dealing with patients. Especially in glaucoma, where it's a chronic disease and you're developing relationships with these patients and families over decades, I think you develop a rapport and a trust. Glaucoma surgery, I tell my patients, is like the back surgery of the eye. So a lot can go wrong and we don't want to try to avoid it, but we'll work through it if we get it, and so you just have to sort of build this sort of relationship to help get them through it. And you get to know the families very well. And tricks, a multicultural faculty and staff are very helpful. I think being able to empathize with people in various situations and to really, and in a busy clinic, I've certainly fallen short of that in many situations, but to do the best you can to really figure out where that's coming from. I mean, you see people slamming on the horn in traffic and what have you. Just people have all sorts of things going on in their day that you really fundamentally don't appreciate it. And we all do our best to do that, and it's good to have somebody like Haley that you can be direct with and ask about how am I saying what I'm saying, because we all, there's a Greek philosopher who said, so you can't separate what's axiomatic from the historical accidents of your culture. We're all built with our own cultural histories and our own societies, and they're not at all the same. Our experiences, our interactions with authorities and other people are completely different across a lot of these groups for reasons that shouldn't exist but are built structurally in our society and have been. So getting over those larger societal issues, I think that individual interaction is really important, and it's something to leverage with organ donation. You think about registries. One of the advantages of doing disease registries like we've done at Callahan with Advancing Sight is that, one, you do leverage the education and the relationships those individual physicians have with those patients and families, and at the same time you link their clinical history and disease records with their ocular tissues that can be acquired. So they become much more powerful tools for research and potential avenues we could think about for education as well. When those discoveries are brought to fruition, we could potentially use those registries to communicate out to families who've been in that process of losing a loved one and providing their tissues for either to save someone's sight or to develop the next new discovery. And I think we're better probably at the sight saving side, as Teresa and I were talking about earlier, but it would be interesting to explore getting out those messages on the research side as well.
Great. I want to kind of continue with your thoughts and really ask the panel, what is the next steps they see as being necessary to build an inclusive future? Particularly where donation is a community expectation and in every community. From our discussion today, we heard about some interesting drivers, what could be drivers of change. We've heard about what were some historical wrongs and maybe ways that we currently practice but could do better to build this inclusive future. So what, in your opinion, most importantly, and thinking about increasing eye donation particularly, but what do organizations need to implement, and how can institutional partnerships working together bring about change that we talked about?
So I think that's an excellent question. And I think one way is really to think about, to utilize the existing structure within communities. Just taking the African-American community as an example, oftentimes, and not in every African-American community and not necessarily for every African-American, but in many African-American communities, the church is a central institution, not just for their faith, but for a whole host of other activities. And so really thinking about ways in which you can engage with churches as a means of reaching. And I think it really is twofold. I think number one, it's access. So you have individuals who are already engaged with the church, and if there's a partnership that can be formed there. But then I think in the very practical sense, helping the church sort of bridge the gap of uncertainty. What does my religious leader feel about organ donation? Is there a barrier? And you can get really granular as well. And this goes to the cultural tailoring. To what extent is organ donation going to interfere with the funeral rites that are practiced in my community? And engaging people to help sort of address those concerns and speak to those concerns, and not necessarily relying exclusively on people that are involved with organ procurement, or but also involving funeral directors and talking to them and having them say, I can make your loved one look as wonderful after donation as you'll never know. No one will ever know. And I'm getting in the weeds here, but I think it's reflective of how we need to be very strategic in thinking about how these communities already are structured, and then tailoring that approach based on the structure in these communities. We really, if we're strategic, we don't have to reinvent the wheel in engaging different communities. There are avenues to engage communities that are already there. I think we just have to really think about it and talk to the people in those communities about how best to navigate them and engage people within certain communities.
Great. Dr. Gross?
I wholeheartedly agree. I keep thinking about, so my husband is Orlando Gutierrez, and he's a Latino nephrologist. So he's a clinician scientist, and he studies health. His research focuses on health disparities in kidneys and kidney disease. And there's a National Kidney Week you might be familiar with, and right before, because you mentioned you study a kidney here or there, and who doesn't love a good kidney? But I remember before COVID hit, and I don't think I'm not sure if it's been run since COVID, but there was an event down in Railroad Park. Have you ever gone to that?
Oh, all the time.
And it's fabulous. So there are balloons and face painting for kids, and families get involved. And so we went because I'm supportive of my husband, and the news was there. So they would interview, the newscasters would interview families and research scientists and clinicians and talking about kidney donation. And it was predominantly African-American population that would come and eat hot dogs and bouncy castles. And we would see church leaders there talking to maybe something we can think about in the future is Eye Week, or this month of August, maybe this time next year, we can have something similar in either Lynn Park or in Railroad Park or something, to be able to address organ donation and underrepresented minority populations. Something to consider. I mean, it was a really well attended, fantastic meeting. You can speak more to it because I was just support team, but
Well, it sounds impactful.
It really was.
That's what I get from that.
I'm sure Dr. Durant may want to say something about it. Or may not.
So interestingly, when you said Railroad Park, I thought you meant just Railroad Park. And when I said, my response was, yeah, I go there all the time.
Oh, okay.
I had not attended that event.
Okay.
That specific
Okay.
event.
Okay. Railroad Park is a great place to go hang out. It's a lovely, lovely, lovely urban park that we just built. But the event is really well attended, and thousands of people. Free T-shirts. I mean, you brings people in. Free hot dogs, T-shirts, balloons for the kids,
Right.
face painting. You know, and folks get out, and you get like a little stress kidney ball. We could have a stress eyeball. Arvo gives those out. We have them. You guys have them. We could just make a whole bunch more and give them to folks, and have the kids throw stress eyeballs at each other. It'd be great. But it's something. It is something to consider in the future going forward. That I'd love to be able to be a part of and help bring to fruition.
Yeah, that's great.
And we can have scientists, basic scientists like me, clinical scientists, folks that study this, be able to chit chat
Right.
with folks that are taxpayers that help pay our research, right? And not just for that reason, but because we really do need, we need folks to be able to donate organs and help others, but also help us as scientists in the future be able to uncover the molecular pathways that we can then slow down the degeneration seen in these blinding diseases.
It's I think that's certainly a great idea. I wonder if we could almost envision as we want to have longer term things as you mentioned, what kind of like bringing that energy. What kind of things can we maybe envision where it's more routine, where that's not the one-time celebration? I just, and that may be a hard question for all of us, is making that a continual process. And that may be the challenge going forward. Dr. Girkin, what are your thoughts?
I'm sort of trying to fill in the few gaps.
Have fun.
I think the barriers in clinical research and in clinical care are well studied. I mean, they're certainly complex and multifactorial, but I think there's an increasing understanding of what they are in our limited field, and I'm sure that's expanded. But the barriers to organ donation, there's a few surveys here and there, but there's, that's one issue. And we talk about, what's the first thing you do is ask, and then listen. And a more organized effort maybe to understand what the barriers are. Is it because it's things that we may not think of? I really thought of the mortician side of it, but that's a real misconception that really maybe that's much more important than I would imagine and I would think, and I'm sure it is to certain populations and certain people. But we really don't understand what those barriers are, and you always want to try to figure out what you're swinging at, before you pick up the bat. So there's that, and I think that's an important component in terms of routine. I'll sort of jump back to that idea of registries and expanding those registries with EMRs, and as painful as sometimes they are, they do collect massive amounts of relevant data, biologic data, and clinical data that you can link to these tissues, and they become an extremely powerful resource. But again, you can also communicate through them. It gives you an avenue of patients that have bought into it already, and those can be your not prophets, but disciples to pass that message on to their relatives and friends. So that might be an avenue where you could basically get information, but also pass information out to those people that you would have access to, that have known someone or themselves planning to donate.
Right. I think you hit upon another key thing about making everyone an equal partner is that you said the term disciple, and and that's I think what we all need to seek is that we need the people embedded in communities and all different groups all of us to be advocates. We can't do stuff. We can't have one group be advocates trying to shout out. We have to bring other people into that fold so we could spread that advocacy. And in some ways, that's maybe not organic getting that going, but if you can, then that's an organic way to sustain, is by building advocacy within. So, well, a lot of great concepts, a lot of great thoughts. I just want to open the floor now, open the discussion to questions from the audience. You could either address those to an individual or to the panel. And so if any of you have those now. Candace, did you have any online?
Well, there's a question from Brett, and he says, something I've noticed are those who are happy to be organ donors, but stop short when it comes to the eyes and skin as well. How do we get over that barrier if we are going to get more diverse donors?
Ooh, that is a great question, and I have some experience here, and there's certainly in the room here a lot of experience. It's understandable that people are concerned about their loved one's looks. Maybe if you imagine your loved one is giving maybe a vein in their leg, that will show at the funeral. So we do a fair amount of education in different areas. Particularly, we work with funeral directors. We have some who sit on our board of trustees. We work with a hospital development group. So we work teaching and training hospital staff to also be our advocate, but to help understand. And we're looking at new ways of reaching out to communities to give the message that with eye donation, that our recovery techs do a really good job. It's a meticulous job. We train very hard for this. And we pay very close attention, where we reconstruct and we clean the area, and all of our funeral directors in our various states, they work with us closely. We work with also medical examiners. So we're able, with our partners like funeral directors, to leave the donor, the person who gave this gift, in a state of rest, where it's really not, it really does not impact the viewing. And that's key thing. And boy, that takes education, because you say, give up your eyes, and you may picture just sockets there. So, and I think that goes across all different groups. But I think that more of that continual education, I think we do a great job with our partners, coroners, funeral directors. But I think for the general population, we have to look at new ways, and we continue to do that. But I think we have to continue to strive new ways to educate the populace.
That's a great answer. What are the things that each of you are most excited about research-wise?
So for me, I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is increasingly, as we think about health disparities, there is an ever-growing acknowledgement that the things that impact the health of certain populations, oftentimes fall outside of the clinical realm. And so it allows us an opportunity to look at those what oftentimes are non-clinical factors, what we call the social determinants of health. You all could probably guess what they are. They, tend to be those things that are at play in places we work and in places where we live, regardless of our backgrounds. And the fact that those things are now being actually measured, and we're figuring out how to measure them and do so in a valid manner, in a systematic way. It's really exciting thinking about moving forward, because my hope is that as we become more sophisticated in the way that we think about them, we then can include them in considerations of how we conceive treatments for various medical problems, particularly those that disproportionately affect minoritized populations. And heretofore, we've known they've existed, but we've oftentimes kind of thrown up our hands and said, well, we've got to just focus on the clinical stuff, because that other stuff we can't do anything about. But if we ignore those other things, it's at our own peril, and most of all at the peril of our patients.
Dr. Durant, you mentioned that term minoritized. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So in terms of the origin of minoritized?
Yeah, and
so,
what that means.
Yeah, so there's a growing sense that the term minority is actually an inaccurate term, in the sense that the subgroups that we typically have referred to as minorities, when we say that, it's sort of, it's passive, right? And in essence, the reason that it's important is because there's been some action to disenfranchise these people, to marginalize them. That action largely has gone unspoken. So the term minoritized is meant to convey that there has been some systematic action to oftentimes push or keep these people on the fringes, and certainly separate from the majority. And so increasingly, you will see people opting to use the word minoritized to ascribe that action more accurately, as opposed to minority.
Right.
And so that's my, I'm not a sociologist or linguist.
You are now. Today you are.
But that's my perspective on
that. You did a great job, and I think the audience, many of the audience may not have been familiar with that term and the idea behind it, and I think there's a lot of power in that word, utility. Dr. Gross, what gets you going?
Oh, I spend my career, as you know, Dr. Grossman, transferring tiny little volumes of liquid from one tube to another tube, and so I get the extreme pleasure of knowing something that nobody cares about before anyone else knows. There are like 10 of us in the world that really love this stuff. Dr. Grossman is one of them. And so it's like, oh, I get to fight. But recently, the project that I'm working on with Dr. Fazio and Dr. Girkin, I think, has been the most exciting for me. It keeps me up at night because for the first time, the basic research side of my lab, we're uncovering proteins that in genes that we didn't really know were expressed in retina at all. My lab discovered them, and now we're finding that in human retina, these genes are upregulated through transcriptomics, and the proteins are overexpressed after high intraocular pressure, and no one had known that those proteins were expressed at all in retina. And so that leads us to the mechanism of how these really crafty cells, these retinal ganglion cells, are trying to get away from the areas of strain, of high strain and stress. And so they're almost like living creatures. They're just like, okay, that hurts, I'm going to go over to this side of the retina now. And that's something that we hadn't known before. And so I think the projects that we're working on now with the human eyes, the donor eyes, and through the legacy of hope, I think it's revolutionary. And we've had some really good success this year at different conferences talking about our results and the excitement that we're seeing in others. But the fact that we get to know these results before other people do, and then we're really uncovering the molecular mechanisms of what's happening in a really common disease, to me is just it's really cool. It's not just little volumes of liquid. It's actually really setting the stage up for better therapeutics in the future. And we have my dream of eventually staving off degeneration is even significantly more close because of the cross collaborations that I'm able to have at UEB and with my partners. Okay, you up.
All right. So, at my heart, I'm a clinician and I treat glaucoma. And glaucoma is a disease that never really gets better. It just sort of slowly goes down. It's the disease of aging. So, it can get depressing. A success is not getting worse. What's exciting, I think, on the research side is that we're really able, I think, to understand a lot more of the mechanisms in glaucoma nowadays and what are some of the fundamental mechanisms. And I believe these organ donor models that we're looking at, along with tissue culture and animal studies and a lot of other work, are getting closer and closer to having a fundamental impact on the disease and developing a new surgical approach and new pharmacological approaches that can halt progression of the disease. And that to me is really exciting because I've just seen so many people fall off that cliff. And it's really tragic to watch that on a daily basis.
I imagine.
Yeah, we've got another one. Latoya pointed out that the word minority has been a concern even with this month being National Minority Donor Awareness Month. And Kelly from our Mississippi Lions Eye Bank says there's a transition in the donation community to use the term multi-ethnic instead of minority. And Kelly's asking, does the panel have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's often hard to group people. This is my thought. And often the ways you group people is only one aspect. So I know when the three of us were looking to do a large project, and rather than talking about African Americans, for us, we were looking at the genetics. So we just kept it to people of African ancestry because they may have gotten here different ways, had different backgrounds and context. So I think, there's different ways to collect or maybe groups self-collect them. But yeah, I'd love to hear your opinions on that.
This is always tricky because I don't think that there are always succinct phrases that fully capture the diversity that we're oftentimes trying to convey in a particular message. I certainly think multi-ethnic, for the purposes of what she was suggesting, I think it's fine. The researcher in me thinks about the fact that, we describe ethnicity here, we define ethnicity here in the US in a very strange way, I think very differently than, it's defined across the globe. We have two ethnic categories in the US, either Hispanic or non-Hispanic for all intents and purposes. So in that sense, we could probably come up with 100 different phrasings and we would find that, they would all be imperfect in some way, shape, or form. But for the purposes, I think, of what she's trying to do to dispense with minority, I think multi-ethnic probably does the trick.
So what about, and I'm going to throw a question back out to Dr. Durant. So what about minoritized instead of minority for that month? Because you can imagine there are people of European descent who were born into poverty and eat eat food that is filled with preservatives because it's cheap and they can't afford. So they live in poverty and they're in a bad environment. And so we know that also creates disease, and
Right.
it has a strong correlation with health disparities. And so that would be, and there, in a sense, our culture keeps impoverished people impoverished. And so they too are minoritized in a sense, even though they're of European descent. They just were not fortunate enough to be born with a wealthy family.
Right. So I think that does actually probably capture a broader meaning. You gave the example of someone of European ancestry, but who is still of perhaps low SES and low formal educational attainment. And I think, we could add a number of other characteristics that, have nothing to do with race or ethnicity, whether it's rural residents, if it's even urban residents, but living in what we would think of as socially deprived areas. And all those individuals, to your point, are minoritized in some way, shape, or form. And in that case, that may be a more, I'm not trying to be cute with a pun here, but that may be a more inclusive
Right, more of an umbrella term.
Yes.
More of an umbrella term.
To really capture the different domains that I think we're all recognizing that that are used to define, one minoritized subgroup or another.
Good point. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our time. And I really, first and foremost, want to thank our panel for joining us today. And they did a fantastic job. I got so much out of this. And I think, this is part of the asking process. I learned a lot. Some things I think I need to change in my brain. And hopefully you learned a lot and maybe have some new questions that you didn't have before. And I want to thank everyone for attending here, and also to you lovely folks online. I'm told a video, the recording will be available later. And for anyone who attended, we will send you a link that you'll be able to watch it at a later time. And I want to thank again all of our partners, particularly the Caring Foundation of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Alabama, who made this possible. Thank you so much.